I don't really know what it is that a Freemason in want of a wife must make the wife of consideration demonstrate between her and him. I've been told things like she must be proficient in knowing how to fashion a quilt. Whether there's any truth to that, I'm not sure, because Roger Mark B. Nelson Toll isn't a person whose word means that means a great deal to me. But the thing is, imagine him. Put yourself in his place, and imagine him trying to draft a psychiatric or psychological profile that works based on the veracity of state propositional knowledge. There's a text I studied which interestingly differentiated between knowledge by acquaintance, propositional knowledge, and knowledge by experience. And I consider Roger to be like the mad scientist trying to convert, because he can't convert people into Freemasons because he mustn't be high enough, and the church must have enough secrecy rules and such. But if you can be a mad scientist and you can't do that as a religionist, maybe you can convert knowledge by experience into propositional knowledge. And that's why I think he's interested in these certain projects that he's not really qualified for and that aren't quite legal. Now I can't wait till he's in the courtroom. I might get my old smile back that day. I might get to use drugs that don't stagger the concept of treatment into a prolonged barn dance that day. But yeah, Capital Chemist does not deserve to be advertised for. You may argue that just because of their lack of qualifications alone, the fact that I was getting taught how much it excited them back before I knew they had no qualifications in these fields, that they love to stop the religious crusader, the martyr, that their theory on what makes a martyr was based on the 16th century establishment of the Freemasons church, their church's interpretation of the four Gospels of Jesus Christ. Now, to me, I don't even enter into debates about which ones do you think are true and which ones aren't. It's a question of a gradient of veracity, and I've already said it, that the one known to scholars for 200 years, and remember, this is the 21st century, so 200 years ago is still well before the establishment of the Freemasons Church, and if they want to hide out in secret and not be the beneficiaries of progress in years that pass since because they chant instead of singing hymns, well, then aren't they just the next Isaac Newtons waiting to happen? But I've already said that's Mark's gospel, and it even is 37 years after the fact. So if you had to trust a game of Chinese whispers to keep the word intact for 37 years, then the Gospel of Mark would be true. Failing that, the Gospel of Mark is the best, or the manuscript with the most veracity. Now then, it's that the authors of Matthew and Luke both had copies of Mark in their possession when they penned and scribed the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And you can do your own studies at home and check. 70% of Mark will be repeated in, I think it's Luke, and 90% repeated in Matthew. It's one or the other, one way around. Either 70% is repeated in Luke and 90% is repeated in Matthew, or 90% is repeated in Luke and 70% is repeated in Matthew. What all that's proven is that whoever wrote Matthew and Luke's Gospels already were holding a copy of Mark in their hands, and it was 10 years, another 10 years after Mark was first written, that they wrote theirs. So you've got all this additional material, and that's when you see the proof that paganism was resourced, and that's on two fronts. I'll call them the natural and the supernatural front, in terms of what's naturally and supernaturally possible now, which is that there were pagan divinities that could walk on water and turn water into wine. Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, 1000 years BC, his miracles are suddenly to appear in Jesus' story. You've got but then there's the naturally possible differentials, which are even contradictory just between Matthew and Luke in relation to the last words, where the last words of Jesus in one book are, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do," and in the other book they are, "Father, into thy hands I commit thy spirit." It might shed some light on why Chop Suey was written by System of a Down, because they're trying to call your attention to, well, how, this man wasn't even given the dignity of preservation of his last words. Even his last words were further mocked. So this is most likely someone whose murder mocked the integrity of the King and Queen's Guard in his day, which means an unjust killing. And that all points back to the accosting in Mark chapter 12, where he's initially asked, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And he says, "Well, you said it." So that's not the answer, "Yes, I am," or the answer, "No, I'm not." It means it could be equivalent to, "Your question has not been understood. Make the question clearer. Your question has not been well perceived." It could mean a whole bunch of things. It could be him asking a question back. "Well, you said it." So you might have had an angry inbreeding Kingsguard atrociously verbally misdirecting and misleading a foreigner into what they perceived to be the ultimate confession, and then killing him without cause, which would have brought shame on that ancient monarchy, and they would have wanted to cover their tracks as best they could. This is why I think a lot of Christians become fans of crime fiction, because it's pointing them back to why they should solve the crime of their own gospel.